Welcome to the Classic Books Reimagined channel. This is part 3 of the audiobook Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice is the second novel by English author Jane Austen, originally published in 1813. It is a novel of manners that follows the character development of Elizabeth Bennet, the protagonist who learns about the repercussions of hasty judgments and comes to appreciate the difference between superficial goodness and actual goodness. It has become one of the most popular novels in English literature, with over 20 million copies sold, and has inspired many derivatives in modern literature. In this audiobook, the original Pride and Prejudice has been reimagined as if it had been originally written by best-selling New York Times and USA Today author Carolyn Brown. Carolyn Brown has written more than 100 novels and 8 novellas and contributed to multiple anthologies selling more than 6 million copies. We hope you enjoy this classic book, Reimagined. Please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and tell us what you like about this reimagined book, or what you think we need to do better next time. Thanks for watching and listening.
Welcome to part 3 of Pride and Prejudice, Reimagined. Today we take the classic book and reimagine it in the style of best-selling romance author Carolyn Brown. If you enjoy this content, please take a minute to like, subscribe, or share this video. You can also hit the bell to be notified of new classic books reimagined as soon as they are published here on YouTube. If there is a classic book you would like to hear reimagined in the style of a modern author, please leave it in the comments.
Part 3, Chapter 21, Whispers of Love and Letters. The aftermath of Mr. Collins's rejected proposal left Elizabeth feeling the uncomfortable sting of tension. Her mother's peevish remarks didn't help, and Mr. Collins himself, expressing his displeasure with stiff manners and a resentful silence, only made things worse. He barely spoke to her, transferring his attentions to Charlotte Lucas, whose patient civility provided a welcome respite for everyone, especially Elizabeth. The next morning brought no relief from Mrs. Bennet's ill humour or ill health. Mr. Collins, still brimming with wounded pride, remained resolute in his plans to stay until Saturday. Elizabeth had hoped his anger might prompt an early departure, but it seemed his schedule was unaltered. After breakfast, the Bennet sisters decided to walk to Meryton, their bright winter coats and bonnets adding splashes of colour to the grey morning. Their goal was to check if Mr. Wickham had returned and to lament his absence from the Netherfield ball. As they entered the bustling town, they were delighted to find him, and he greeted them warmly, his easy charm evident in every smile. "Good morning, ladies," Mr. Wickham said, tipping his hat. His brown eyes sparkled with a mix of regret and relief. "I apologise for missing the ball. It was unavoidable." Elizabeth, walking beside him, replied, "We missed your company greatly, Mr. Wickham. It wasn't the same without you." As they strolled toward their aunt's house, Mr. Wickham confided in Elizabeth. "As the time approached, I realised it would be best not to meet Mr. Darcy. Being in the same room with him for hours would have been unbearable. Unpleasant scenes might have arisen, affecting more than just myself." Elizabeth nodded, appreciating his candour. "You showed great restraint, Mr. Wickham. It must have been difficult." They continued their walk, deep in conversation, while another officer accompanied them. Elizabeth enjoyed Mr. Wickham's attention, feeling both flattered and pleased at the opportunity to introduce him to her family. Upon their return to Longbourn, a letter arrived for Jane from Netherfield. The elegant envelope, with its delicate flowing script, was opened with anticipation. Elizabeth watched as Jane's expression changed while reading it. Concerned, Elizabeth followed her sister upstairs once their guests had left. In the privacy of their room, Jane held out the letter. "It's from Caroline Bingley. They've all left Netherfield for London, and they have no intention of returning." Elizabeth's eyes widened. "What does she say?" Jane read aloud, "We have just decided to follow my brother to town and will dine in Grosvenor Street tonight. I regret leaving Hertfordshire, but I hope we can maintain our friendship through frequent letters." Elizabeth listened with growing scepticism. "It seems Miss Bingley is more interested in keeping her brother away from here." Jane continued, her voice tinged with sadness. "When Charles left us yesterday, he thought his business in London would only take a few days, but we are sure he will not hurry back. We have many acquaintances in town already, and I wish you could join us. I hope your Christmas is filled with gaiety and you won't miss us too much." "It's clear she doesn't want him to return," Elizabeth said firmly. "She's trying to keep him away from you." Jane shook her head. "No, it must be his decision. Caroline wouldn't deceive me like this. She must believe what she's saying." Elizabeth sighed. "Jane, you must see that Miss Bingley is trying to manipulate the situation. She wants her brother to marry Miss Darcy, not you." Jane looked troubled. "But can I be happy if his sisters and friends are against our match?" Elizabeth squeezed her sister's hand. "You must decide what's most important to you. If you truly love him, don't let them deter you." "I couldn't hesitate, even if they disapproved," Jane admitted, a faint smile crossing her lips. "But if he doesn't return, my choice won't matter." "Don't lose hope. I'm sure he will come back," Elizabeth reassured her. "Miss Bingley can't control his heart." Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Bennet's lamentations about the departure of the Netherfield party. She expressed her disappointment at their leaving, just as they were all becoming close. Yet she quickly consoled herself with the hope that Mr. Bingley would soon return and dine at Longbourn. Her concluding remark was a practical one, promising a grand dinner despite it being a simple family affair. The sisters agreed to keep the full details of Caroline's letter from their mother, hoping to avoid unnecessary worry. As they descended the stairs, Elizabeth felt a renewed determination to support Jane and uncover the truth behind Mr. Bingley's sudden departure. Chapter 22. A New Engagement. The Bennets were invited to dine with the Lucases, and as usual, Charlotte Lucas graciously lent her ear to Mr. Collins for most of the day. Elizabeth seized a moment to express her gratitude. "Thank you, Charlotte," she said earnestly. "You have no idea how much I appreciate your patience with him. It keeps him in good spirits, and for that I am more grateful than I can express." Charlotte smiled warmly. "It's my pleasure, Elizabeth. I'm glad to be of help, and it's really no trouble at all." But Charlotte's intentions were more calculated than Elizabeth could imagine. Her kindness was part of a larger scheme, to divert Mr. Collins's attentions away from Elizabeth and toward herself. As the evening came to an end, Charlotte felt optimistic about her success, though she knew Mr. Collins's impending departure added an element of urgency. The next morning, Mr. Collins, driven by a determination to secure Charlotte's hand, slipped out of Longbourn unnoticed. He walked briskly to Lucas Lodge, his heart set on proposing to Charlotte before anyone could suspect his plan. Charlotte, seeing him approach from her window, hurried outside to, accidentally, meet him in the lane. "Good morning, Mr. Collins," she greeted him, a hint of surprise in her voice. "What brings you here so early?" "Miss Lucas," he began, taking her hand with a solemn look, "I must speak with you. I cannot leave Hertfordshire without knowing if you would do me the great honour of becoming my wife." Charlotte listened, her heart pounding. His proposal, though expected, was more passionate than she had anticipated. "Mr. Collins," she replied, "I am honoured by your offer." In the time it took for Mr. Collins to deliver his lengthy speeches, everything was settled to their mutual satisfaction. They walked back to the house together, where he eagerly asked her to set a wedding date. Though she deferred the decision for now, Charlotte felt no need to prolong their courtship. Sir William and Lady Lucas were overjoyed by the match. It was a significant opportunity for their daughter, who had little fortune of her own. Lady Lucas immediately began calculating how many years Mr. Bennet might live, while Sir William fantasized about Charlotte and Mr. Collins making their grand entrance at St. James's once he inherited Longbourn. The younger Lucas girls were thrilled at the prospect of debuting into society sooner than expected, and the boys were relieved from the worry that Charlotte might remain unmarried. Charlotte herself, though composed, reflected on her good fortune. At 27, with no great beauty, she had secured a stable future. Mr. Collins might not be charming or sensible, but he was a suitable match for someone in her position. However, Charlotte dreaded Elizabeth's reaction. She valued Elizabeth's friendship deeply and knew this decision would shock her. She instructed Mr. Collins to keep their engagement a secret until she could tell Elizabeth herself. Mr. Collins promised, though he found it challenging to contain his excitement. At Longbourn, curiosity about Mr. Collins's absence ran high. Upon his return, he faced direct questions, which he artfully dodged. Mrs. Bennet, delighted by his promise to visit again, expressed her joy. "Mr. Collins, you must come back soon. We would be so happy to see you." "My dear madam," Mr. Collins replied, "I eagerly look forward to my next visit." Mr. Bennet, less enthused, cautioned, "But won't Lady Catherine disapprove?" Mr. Collins reassured him, "I shall seek her approval before taking any such step." "You must avoid her displeasure at all costs," Mr. Bennet advised dryly. The ladies retired for the night, surprised by Mr. Collins's intent to return so soon. Mrs. Bennet speculated he might turn his attention to one of her younger daughters, a prospect Mary found agreeable. She saw potential in Mr. Collins, despite his lack of intellect, and believed she could improve him. The next morning, after breakfast, Charlotte arrived at Longbourn to privately speak with Elizabeth. As they settled in Elizabeth's room, Charlotte revealed her news. "Elizabeth, I have something important to tell you. Mr. Collins proposed to me yesterday, and I accepted." Elizabeth was stunned. "Engaged to Mr. Collins? My dear Charlotte, that's impossible." Charlotte's composed demeanour faltered briefly. "Why should it be so surprising? Do you think it's so unlikely that Mr. Collins could win someone's favour because he failed with you?" Elizabeth, regaining her composure, replied, "I only meant that I am surprised, but if you are happy, then I am happy for you." Charlotte nodded. "Thank you, Elizabeth. I know this must be unexpected, but I'm not romantic. I seek a comfortable home, and Mr. Collins offers that. Considering his character and position, my chances of happiness with him are as good as most." "Of course," Elizabeth said, though her heart was heavy. After an awkward pause, they rejoined the family. Charlotte left soon after, and Elizabeth was left to ponder the situation. She couldn't reconcile herself to the idea of Charlotte marrying Mr. Collins. Though she respected Charlotte's practical approach to marriage, the idea of such an unsuitable match was distressing. The thought of Charlotte lowering herself to marry for security rather than affection weighed heavily on her mind. As the days passed, Elizabeth tried to come to terms with Charlotte's decision. She knew her friend had made a choice she felt was best for her future, even if it meant sacrificing love for stability. Elizabeth resolved to support Charlotte, despite her misgivings, and hoped her friend would find contentment in her new life. Chapter 23. Unforeseen Announcements and Unsettling News. Elizabeth was sitting with her mother and sisters in the cosy sitting room, a fire crackling in the hearth, as she pondered over what she had learned from Charlotte. The air was thick with anticipation, and Elizabeth was unsure whether she should reveal Charlotte's news. Her thoughts were interrupted when Sir William Lucas arrived, his face beaming with the excitement of his errand. "Good afternoon, ladies," he said, bowing with the flourish of a courtier. "I bring joyous news from Lucas Lodge. My dear Charlotte is engaged to Mr. Collins." The Bennet family was stunned into silence. Mrs. Bennet, recovering first, protested, "Sir William, there must be some mistake. Mr. Collins wants to marry Lizzie." Lydia, always blunt, added, "Good Lord, Sir William, how can you tell such a story?" Sir William, maintaining his courteous demeanour, responded, "I assure you, madam, there is no mistake. Mr. Collins has proposed to my daughter, and she has accepted." Elizabeth, feeling it was her duty to step in, said, "Sir William is correct. Charlotte told me herself this morning. We should congratulate them." Jane quickly joined in. "Yes, of course. We wish them all the happiness in the world." As the initial shock wore off, Mrs. Bennet's feelings shifted to indignation and disbelief. She barely contained herself until Sir William left, then burst out, "This is impossible. Mr. Collins has been deceived. They will never be happy, and this match must be broken off." The rest of the day was filled with her lamentations, blaming Elizabeth for the turn of events and feeling that she had been cruelly wronged by everyone involved. Her resentment lasted well beyond that day, extending into weeks and months of coldness towards Sir William, Lady Lucas, and especially Charlotte. Mr. Bennet, on the other hand, found the situation amusing. "It seems Charlotte Lucas is as foolish as my wife, and even more foolish than my daughter," he remarked with a chuckle. Jane, always the peacemaker, expressed her surprise, but sincerely wished for Charlotte's happiness. Kitty and Lydia were indifferent, seeing the engagement as merely another piece of gossip to share in Meryton. Lady Lucas, savouring her moment of triumph, visited Longbourn more frequently, much to Mrs. Bennet's chagrin. She delighted in discussing the engagement, even though Mrs. Bennet's sour looks and sharp comments tried to dampen her joy. Between Elizabeth and Charlotte, a restrained silence developed. Elizabeth, deeply disappointed by Charlotte's pragmatic decision, turned her attentions to Jane, whose integrity and gentle nature provided a comforting contrast. As days passed without any word from Mr. Bingley, Elizabeth's concern for her sister grew. Jane had responded to Caroline Bingley's letter and was anxiously awaiting a reply. When Mr. Collins's letter arrived, addressed to Mr. Bennet, it was filled with the pompous gratitude one would expect. He proudly announced his engagement to Miss Lucas and expressed his eagerness to return to Longbourn, much to Mrs. Bennet's dismay. "This is unbearable," Mrs. Bennet complained. "Why must he come here instead of staying at Lucas Lodge? And why did he have to be in love while my health is so fragile? Lovers are the most disagreeable of guests." Elizabeth and Jane tried to distract themselves from the worry over Mr. Bingley's prolonged absence. Rumours in Meryton suggested he might not return to Netherfield for the entire winter, a notion that Mrs. Bennet vehemently denied as scandalous falsehood. Elizabeth began to fear that Mr. Bingley's sisters and Mr. Darcy would succeed in keeping him away from Jane. The thought pained her, but she could not dismiss it entirely. Jane, though more anxious, concealed her feelings, while Mrs. Bennet's constant fretting only added to the tension. When Mr. Collins returned, his exuberance was undiminished despite the cooler reception. He spent most of his days at Lucas Lodge, leaving the Bennet household relieved by his absence. Still, his presence was a constant reminder of the unsettling changes. Mrs. Bennet, in particular, was inconsolable. The very mention of Charlotte's engagement sent her into fits of ill humour. She viewed Charlotte as an intruder, imagining her already plotting to take over Longbourn. "Indeed, Mr. Bennet," she lamented one evening, "it is unbearable to think that Charlotte Lucas will one day be mistress of this house, to see her take my place." Mr. Bennet, trying to soothe her, replied, "My dear, do not dwell on such gloomy thoughts. Let us hope for better things. Perhaps I will outlive you, and you will be spared the sight." This was no comfort to Mrs. Bennet, who continued her complaints. "I cannot bear it. If it weren't for the entail, I wouldn't mind." "And what would you not mind, my dear?" "Anything at all." "Let us be thankful, then, that you're preserved from such insensibility," Mr. Bennet said with a smile. "I will never be thankful for anything about the entail. How could anyone have the conscience to entail an estate away from one's own daughters for the sake of Mr. Collins? I leave that for you to decide," Mr. Bennet concluded, leaving his wife to her grievances. As winter settled in, Elizabeth found solace in her sister's company and held on to the hope that true love would eventually triumph over all obstacles. Chapter 24. A letter of closure and unexpected comfort. Miss Bingley's letter arrived, putting an end to any lingering doubts. Its words carried the assurance that they were all settled in London for the winter, with regret expressed from her brother for not having had the chance to bid farewell to their Hertfordshire friends before their departure. Hope was extinguished, leaving Jane to sift through the rest of the letter for any semblance of comfort. Apart from the writer's professed affection, there was little to offer solace. Miss Darcy's praises dominated the pages, along with Caroline's joyous boasts of their growing intimacy and her predictions of the fulfilment of earlier wishes. She also gleefully mentioned her brother's stay at Mr. Darcy's estate and excitedly detailed some plans regarding new furniture. Elizabeth, upon hearing the news from Jane, simmered with silent indignation. Her heart wrestled between concern for her sister and resentment toward all others. She dismissed Caroline's assertion of her brother's partiality to Miss Darcy, doubting it entirely. She remained convinced of Bingley's genuine fondness for Jane, but couldn't help but feel anger and contempt toward his lack of resolve, allowing himself to be manipulated by his scheming companions at the expense of his own happiness and Jane's. As days passed, Jane struggled with her emotions, finding it difficult to confide in Elizabeth, until, finally, in a moment alone, she couldn't contain her feelings any longer. "Oh, if only our mother had more control over herself!" Jane exclaimed. "Her constant remarks about him are like daggers to my heart, but I refuse to dwell on it. It won't last forever. He will fade from memory, and we will move on." Elizabeth looked at her sister with concern, but Jane pressed on. "You doubt me, Lizzie. You doubt that I can let go, but I assure you, he may linger in my memory as the most amiable man I've known, but that is all. I have neither hope nor despair, and nothing to blame him for. Thank goodness I don't have that pain. In time, I will overcome—" With a steadier voice, she continued, "What comforts me is that it was merely a fancy, a harmless mistake on my part. It has hurt no one but myself." "Jane, my dear," Elizabeth said, moved by her sister's resilience, "your kindness and selflessness are truly angelic. I feel as though I have never appreciated you enough, never loved you as you deserve." Jane quickly deflected the praise, attributing it to Elizabeth's affection. "No, Lizzie, you give me too much credit. It's your warmth and love that sustain me." Elizabeth shook her head. "No, this is unfair. You see the good in everyone, and it pains you when I speak ill of anyone. I only wish to see you happy and perfect, but you resist it. Don't worry, I won't encroach on your boundless goodwill. I only truly love a few, and the more I see of the world, the more disillusioned I become. 2 recent events have confirmed my cynicism, but I won't elaborate." "Please, Lizzie, don't let these feelings consume you," Jane pleaded. "You underestimate the influence of circumstance and personality. Consider Mr. Collins's respectability and Charlotte's steady character. Maybe there is genuine affection there, for everyone's sake." Elizabeth shook her head. "I cannot agree. Mr. Collins is pompous and narrow-minded. You know it as well as I do, and you must see, as I do, that any woman who marries him cannot have proper judgment. I cannot defend Charlotte, no matter how much I admire her. I cannot let one person change my principles or convince me that selfishness equals prudence." Jane sighed. "Your words are too harsh, Lizzie. I hope you'll see their happiness and understand." Their conversation shifted away from Mr. Bingley, and from that day forward, his name was rarely mentioned between them. Mrs. Bennet, however, continued to lament Mr. Bingley's absence, her perplexity unabated. Elizabeth tried to explain it away, but her mother remained unconvinced. Her only comfort was the hope of his return in the summer. Mr. Bennet approached the matter with a lighter touch. "So, Lizzie," he said one day, "it seems your sister has had her heart broken. I congratulate her. A little disappointment in love adds a certain charm, doesn't it? When will it be your turn? Don't let Jane outshine you for too long. Now is your chance. There are enough officers in Meryton to disappoint all the young ladies. Let Wickham be your choice. He's a charming fellow and would disappoint you in style." Elizabeth chuckled. "Thank you, sir, but I prefer a less agreeable man. We can't all expect Jane's luck." "True," Mr. Bennet agreed, "but at least you have a loving mother who will make the most of whatever happens." Mr. Wickham's presence brought some relief to the Longbourn household. His openness about his past encounters with Mr. Darcy and the sympathy he garnered from the family lifted their spirits. Everyone delighted in their newfound dislike for Mr. Darcy, condemning him as the worst of men. Jane alone sought to find excuses for Mr. Darcy's behaviour, advocating for understanding and forgiveness. but to the rest of Hertfordshire society, Mr. Darcy was condemned without mercy. Chapter 25. New Beginnings and Winter Revelations. After a week of love declarations and dreamy plans, Mr. Collins was reluctantly called away from his beloved Charlotte as Saturday arrived. Though the separation pained him, he found solace in preparing for their future, hopeful that his next return to Hertfordshire would bring the day when he could finally call himself the happiest of men. He took leave of the Bennet family with his usual solemnity, wishing his fair cousins health and happiness once more, and promising Mr. Bennet another letter of thanks. On the following Monday, Mrs. Bennet's spirits were lifted by the arrival of her brother and his wife, the Gardiners, who came to spend Christmas at Longbourn as they did every year. Mr. Gardiner, a gentlemanly man with refined manners and a good education, stood in stark contrast to his sister. The Netherfield ladies would find it hard to believe that a man involved in trade could be so well-bred and agreeable. Mrs. Gardiner, several years younger than Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Phillips, was amiable, intelligent, and elegant, quickly becoming a favourite with her Longbourn nieces, especially Jane and Elizabeth. Upon arrival, Mrs. Gardiner gracefully distributed presents and described the latest London fashions, her voice soft and her movements elegant, capturing her niece's rapt attention. Her dress of deep blue silk shimmered in the candlelight, and her auburn hair was swept up in an artful chignon, adorned with a simple pearl comb. The gifts she brought were thoughtful and exquisite, from delicate lace gloves to small bottles of French perfume. Once the excitement of gift-giving was over, it was time to listen, as Mrs. Bennet had many grievances to share. "We have been so ill-used, sister," Mrs. Bennet lamented, her voice trembling with indignation. "Jane could have married Mr. Bingley, and Lizzie could have been Mrs. Collins if not for her stubbornness. Now Lady Lucas will have a married daughter before I do, and the Longbourn estate remains entailed. The Lucases are so self-serving. It makes me quite ill to think about it." Mrs. Gardiner, who had already heard much of this through Jane and Elizabeth's letters, responded gently, "I'm so sorry to hear that, sister. But tell me more about these new fashions in London." Later, in a private moment with Elizabeth in the cosy library, warmed by a crackling fire, Mrs. Gardiner expressed her sympathy. "It would have been a desirable match for Jane. It's a shame it ended as it did, but such things happen often. A young man like Mr. Bingley can easily fall in love with a pretty girl and just as easily forget her when separated." Elizabeth, wrapped in a soft cashmere shawl, replied, "That might be true for some, but our situation is different. It's rare for friends to convince a man of independent fortune to abandon a girl he was deeply in love with just days before." Mrs. Gardiner raised an eyebrow, a hint of mischief in her eyes. The phrase "deeply in love" is overused and vague. How deep was Mr. Bingley's affection? Elizabeth thought back to their interactions. He was completely engrossed in her, neglecting others, and at his own ball he offended several young ladies by not asking them to dance. He was entirely focused on Jane. Mrs. Gardiner sighed. "Poor Jane, she may not recover quickly. It would have been better if it happened to you, Lizzie. You would have laughed it off. Do you think she'd come back to London with us? A change of scenery might help." Elizabeth brightened at the idea. "I'm sure she would. It could do her a world of good." "I hope she won't let thoughts of Mr. Bingley influence her decision. We live in a different part of town, and our social circles don't overlap. They are unlikely to meet unless he seeks her out." Elizabeth smiled. "That's unlikely. Mr. Darcy would never allow Mr. Bingley to visit Gracechurch Street. Mr. Darcy wouldn't even enter the area without feeling the need for a month's purification afterward." "Good," Mrs. Gardiner said, her laugh a musical lilt. "The less they see of each other, the better. But does Jane still correspond with his sister?" "Not for long," Elizabeth replied. "Caroline will likely end it." Despite Elizabeth's confident words, she harboured a glimmer of hope that Mr. Bingley's affections might be rekindled, and that he could overcome his friend's influence. Jane accepted her aunt's invitation with pleasure, anticipating the relief that time away might bring. While the Bingleys occupied her thoughts, Jane hoped that by not living under the same roof as her brother, Caroline would allow her to visit without encountering him. The Gardiners stayed for a week, during which there was never a dull moment. Mrs. Bennet ensured that they were entertained every day, with engagements involving the Phillipses, the Lucases, and the officers. Mr. Wickham's presence at these gatherings and his interactions with Elizabeth did not go unnoticed by Mrs. Gardiner, who resolved to speak to Elizabeth about the prudence of encouraging such an attachment. Mrs. Gardiner found herself intrigued by Wickham, who delighted her with tales of Derbyshire, where she had spent much time before her marriage. They shared acquaintances and memories of Pemberley, where she had known the late Mr. Darcy. Comparing her recollections with Wickham's descriptions, she found an endless source of conversation, although Wickham's account of the current Mr. Darcy's treatment of him soured her memories, reinforcing her belief that Mr. Darcy was indeed a proud and ill-natured man. As the festive week drew to a close, Elizabeth felt a mix of relief and anticipation. The visit had provided distraction and comfort, yet she knew the unresolved tension still lingered, waiting to resurface. The Gardiner's departure left a void, but also a promise of future reunions and the hope that change might bring healing and new opportunities for happiness. Chapter 26. A Cautious Heart. Mrs. Gardiner's caution to Elizabeth came gently and wisely on the first opportunity they had alone. Sitting in the cosy parlour, where the fire crackled warmly and the scent of pine filled the air, Mrs. Gardiner spoke earnestly. "Lizzie, you're too sensible to fall in love merely because you're warned against it, so I'll speak openly. Be on your guard with Mr. Wickham. Don't let your affection for him grow, for his lack of fortune makes it imprudent. He's charming, yes, and if he had the fortune he deserves, I'd say you couldn't do better. But as it stands, you must use your good sense. Your father trusts in your judgment, and you mustn't disappoint him." Elizabeth, dressed in a soft green gown that matched the sparkle in her eyes, replied with a hint of humour. "My dear aunt, you're being very serious." "Yes, Lizzie, and I hope you'll be serious too." Elizabeth's smile softened. "Don't worry, I'll take care of myself and Mr. Wickham too. I won't let him fall in love with me if I can help it." Mrs. Gardiner raised an eyebrow. "Elizabeth, be serious." Elizabeth nodded, her expression sincere. "I'm not in love with Mr. Wickham, but he is the most agreeable man I've ever met. If he becomes truly attached to me, it might be better that he doesn't. I see the imprudence of it. Oh, that abominable Mr. Darcy! My father's good opinion means the world to me, and I'd be miserable to lose it. I'd hate to make any of you unhappy, but love often ignores practical concerns. All I can promise is not to rush into anything. I won't be in a hurry to believe myself his first object. I'll do my best to be wise." Mrs. Gardiner smiled warmly. "Perhaps it would be wise to discourage his visits. Don't remind your mother to invite him so often." Elizabeth laughed softly. "As I did the other day? Very true, but it's on your account he's been invited so much this week. Mother believes in constant company for her guests. I promise to do what's wise. Are you satisfied?" Her aunt nodded. "I am. Thank you for understanding, Lizzie." Elizabeth squeezed her aunt's hand. "Thank you for your kindness." They parted with mutual understanding, a rare instance of advice given and received without resentment. Soon after, Mr. Collins returned to Hertfordshire, taking up residence with the Lucases. His marriage was imminent, and Mrs. Bennet, though resigned, still grumbled about the match, wishing them happiness in a tone that implied the opposite. On the eve of the wedding, Charlotte visited Longbourn for a final farewell. Elizabeth, embarrassed by her mother's grudging well-wishes, accompanied her friend downstairs. "I shall depend on hearing from you often, Eliza," Charlotte said, her eyes bright with affection. "You certainly shall," Elizabeth assured her. "And will you come to see me?" "We'll often meet in Hertfordshire, I hope." "I'm not likely to leave Kent for some time. Promise to visit me at Hunsford." Elizabeth, though doubtful of the pleasure such a visit would bring, couldn't refuse. "I promise." "My father and Maria are visiting in March. Will you join us? You'll be as welcome as either of them." The next day, the wedding took place, and the newlyweds departed for Kent from the church door. The event provided ample gossip, and Elizabeth soon received letters from Charlotte, regular, but lacking the intimacy they once shared. Charlotte wrote cheerfully about her new home, Lady Catherine's kindness, and the comforts surrounding her, but Elizabeth sensed the true depth of her friend's feelings could only be discerned in person. Meanwhile, Jane wrote to announce her safe arrival in London. Elizabeth eagerly awaited more news, particularly about the Bingleys. Jane's second letter, however, was disappointing. She hadn't seen or heard from Caroline, who claimed Jane's letter must have been lost. Jane planned to visit Grosvenor Street. When Jane finally saw Caroline, the encounter was lukewarm. Caroline claimed to be happy to see her, but her demeanour said otherwise. Jane's letter to Elizabeth conveyed her disillusionment. "My dearest Lizzie, I was wrong about Miss Bingley's regard for me. She didn't return my visit for a week and seemed indifferent when she finally did. I pity her, though I don't understand her motives. She must feel guilty, and I suspect anxiety for her brother is the cause. Despite knowing he doesn't care for me, she tries to believe he's interested in Miss Darcy. There's an air of duplicity I can't ignore. I'll focus on what makes me happy, your love and our dear uncle and aunt's kindness. Miss Bingley mentioned her brother might not return to Netherfield. We'll keep this to ourselves. I'm glad you have good news from Hunsford. Please visit them as planned." Elizabeth felt a pang of sadness for Jane, but was relieved her sister saw Caroline's true nature. She no longer harboured any hope for Mr. Bingley's return, and wished him well with Miss Darcy, imagining he might regret losing Jane. Mrs. Gardiner, recalling Elizabeth's promise, asked for an update on Mr. Wickham. Elizabeth wrote back, revealing his apparent interest had shifted elsewhere. Though she observed this without much pain, it stung her pride slightly. Still, she was relieved, feeling a sense of closure. She wrote, "Dear Aunt, I've realised I was never truly in love with Mr. Wickham. Had I been, I'd detest him now. But I feel no ill will, even towards Miss King. My vanity is satisfied believing I was his first choice if not for fortune. His pursuit of independence is natural, and I wish him happiness. My heart remains untouched, and while I might be more interesting if I were heartbroken, I don't regret my insignificance. Kitty and Lydia take his departure harder than I do, not yet understanding that handsome young men need means to live on as well." Mrs. Gardiner acknowledged Elizabeth's letter, understanding her niece's sentiments. Elizabeth's practical approach and resilience shone through, ready to face whatever lay ahead with grace and wisdom. Chapter 27. A Journey to Hunsford. With January and February marked by nothing more exciting than cold, muddy walks to Meryton, the Bennet household found little to break the monotony. But March brought the promise of something new, as Elizabeth prepared for her trip to Hunsford. At first, she hadn't been too keen on the idea, but knowing how much Charlotte depended on her visit, and considering how dull life at Longbourn could be, the prospect soon grew on her. The thought of seeing her dear friend again, along with the change of scenery, made her look forward to the journey. Adding a night in London to visit Jane sweetened the deal further. The arrangements were perfect. Elizabeth would travel with Sir William Lucas and his daughter Maria. The only bittersweet note was leaving her father, who, despite his gruff exterior, would miss her dearly. He even promised to write to her, which was a rare show of affection. Elizabeth's farewell with Mr. Wickham was warm, filled with kind wishes and a touch of wistfulness. Despite his new pursuits, he couldn't forget that Elizabeth had been the first to truly listen and admire him. His parting words were full of kindness and shared jokes about Lady Catherine de Bourgh, reinforcing the bond between them. The journey the next day, though only 24 miles, seemed longer with the company of Sir William and Maria Lucas. Sir William's incessant tales of his knighthood had long lost their charm, and Maria, though good-natured, offered little in the way of stimulating conversation. Elizabeth found their chatter as tedious as the rattle of the chaise they rode in. By noon, they arrived at Gracechurch Street. Jane, radiant as ever, greeted them warmly at the door. The Gardiner children, too shy to come downstairs, peeked eagerly from the staircase. The day was filled with the bustle of shopping, and ended with an enjoyable evening at the theatre, where Elizabeth found a moment to sit by her aunt and inquire after Jane. In the cosy warmth of the theatre, Mrs. Gardiner sighed and revealed that despite Jane's brave face, there were moments of deep dejection. Elizabeth was pained, but not surprised. Mrs. Gardiner also shared details of Miss Bingley's visit, confirming that Jane had indeed given up on the acquaintance. Turning the conversation to lighter matters, Mrs. Gardiner teased Elizabeth about Mr. Wickham's sudden interest in Miss King. "But Lizzie, what sort of girl is Miss King? I'd hate to think our friend mercenary." Elizabeth, dressed in a soft lavender gown that matched the gentle warmth in her eyes, responded, "Dear aunt, what's the difference between being mercenary and prudent in marriage? Where does discretion end and avarice begin? Last Christmas you feared Wickham marrying me was imprudent, and now you call him mercenary for courting a girl with £10,000. Mrs. Gardiner laughed softly. "Just tell me about Miss King, Lizzie." "She's a good girl, I suppose. I know no harm of her. But he ignored her until she inherited a fortune. Why should he have paid her attention before? It wasn't sensible for him to pursue me without money, so why court a girl he didn't care for who was also poor? But it seems improper to pursue her so soon after her grandfather's death. A man in his situation can't afford the luxury of waiting. If she doesn't mind, why should we? Her acceptance doesn't excuse him. It shows she lacks sense or feeling." Elizabeth shrugged. "Fine, he's mercenary and she's foolish. No, Lizzie, I don't want to think ill of a young man who has lived so long in Derbyshire." Elizabeth's eyes twinkled mischievously. "Oh, aunt, I have a poor opinion of all young men in Derbyshire, and their friends in Hertfordshire aren't much better. I'm tired of them all. Thank goodness, tomorrow I go to meet a man without any agreeable qualities. Stupid men are the only ones worth knowing." Mrs. Gardiner smiled knowingly. "Careful, Lizzie. That sounds like disappointment." Before the play ended, Elizabeth received an unexpected invitation to join her aunt and uncle on a summer tour. "We're not sure how far we'll go," Mrs. Gardiner said. "Maybe to the lakes." Elizabeth's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Oh, dear aunt, what joy! You've given me new life. Goodbye to disappointment. What are men compared to mountains and lakes? We'll have adventures to remember and describe accurately. No jumbled memories for us." The journey to Hunsford brought mixed emotions. Elizabeth's anticipation of seeing Charlotte again was tempered by the inevitable awkwardness of Mr. Collins. Yet, as she left Longbourn behind, she embraced the change, ready for whatever new experiences awaited her. The days passed quickly, filled with laughter and the comfort of family. The Gardiners ensured their visit was enjoyable, packed with outings and gatherings that kept Elizabeth's spirits high. Mrs. Gardiner, noticing Elizabeth's curiosity about her trip, reassured her niece. "You'll have a wonderful time with Charlotte, Lizzie. Just keep your heart guarded and your spirit open." With a final hug, Elizabeth boarded the carriage with Sir William and Maria, waving goodbye to her family. As the wheels rolled forward, she felt a mix of excitement and uncertainty, eager to see what Hunsford would bring and determined to make the most of every moment. Chapter 28. New Paths and Old Friends. Elizabeth's spirits were high as they set off the next day on their journey. Each new sight along the way seemed to sparkle with interest. The memory of Jane's healthy glow and the promise of a northern tour buoyed her spirits. As they left the high road for the winding lane to Hunsford, every turn brought eager anticipation. The paling of Rosings Park came into view, and Elizabeth couldn't help but smile at the thought of its imposing mistress. Finally, the parsonage appeared, nestled amidst a garden that sloped gently toward the road. The house, with its green pales and laurel hedge, looked as inviting as Charlotte had described. Mr. Collins and Charlotte stood at the door, their faces alight with smiles. The carriage stopped at the small gate, and in moments they were all out, greeting one another with genuine joy. Charlotte's warm welcome reassured Elizabeth that her decision to visit had been the right one. Mr. Collins, ever the epitome of formal civility, detained her at the gate with inquiries about her family. His grand tour of the house began immediately, pointing out the neatness of the entrance with a flourish. Inside, the house was small but cosy, with each room reflecting Charlotte's touch of elegance and care. As they settled into the parlour, Mr. Collins welcomed them again, his voice filled with a pompous pride that Elizabeth found amusing. He emphasized the good proportions of the room and its furniture, seemingly addressing Elizabeth directly, as if to remind her of what she had declined by refusing him. Elizabeth, however, could not muster any regret, instead marvelling at Charlotte's cheerful demeanour in such company. Charlotte's composed responses to her husband's oft embarrassing remarks showed her skill in managing the situation. When Mr. Collins invited them to admire the garden, he led them through every path and crosswalk, detailing each view with an exhaustive thoroughness that left little room for beauty. His pride in the number of trees and the layout of the garden was palpable, but the crown jewel of his tour was the view of Rosings, visible through an opening in the trees. "Look there, Miss Elizabeth," he said, gesturing grandly. "No view in the kingdom can compare to this sight of Rosings." Elizabeth stifled a smile, admiring Charlotte's ability to encourage her husband's enthusiasm without appearing overly affected by it. When the ladies declined further exploration, due to their delicate shoes, Sir William accompanied Mr. Collins, leaving Charlotte to show Elizabeth and Maria around the house. Inside, the house was neat and comfortable, with everything arranged to Charlotte's meticulous standards. Elizabeth admired the comfort and charm, crediting her friend for the inviting atmosphere. When Mr. Collins was out of sight and mind, the place truly felt like a home. Over dinner, the conversation turned to Lady Catherine de Bourgh, whom Mr. Collins spoke of with reverence. "Miss Elizabeth, you shall meet Lady Catherine at church on Sunday. She is the epitome of affability and condescension, and I have no doubt you will be honoured with her notice." Charlotte nodded, adding, "Lady Catherine is a very attentive neighbour." "Indeed," Mr. Collins agreed. "We dine at Rosings twice a week, and her ladyship's carriage always brings us home. She has several, you know." The evening was filled with Hertfordshire news and stories already shared in letters. As Elizabeth retired to her room, she reflected on Charlotte's contentment and ability to manage her husband with such grace. She anticipated the rhythm of her visit, the quiet moments, the inevitable interruptions by Mr. Collins, and the anticipated interactions with Rosings residents. The next day, a sudden commotion downstairs interrupted Elizabeth as she prepared for a walk. Maria burst into the room, breathless with excitement. "Oh, Eliza, come quickly to the dining room. There's something to see." Curious and amused, Elizabeth followed Maria, only to find two ladies in a low phaeton at the garden gate. "Is this all?" she asked, expecting something more dramatic. Maria, wide-eyed, whispered, "That's not Lady Catherine. It's Mrs. Jenkinson and Miss de Bourgh." Elizabeth observed the scene with amusement. Miss de Bourgh, looking frail and cross, conversed with Mr. Collins and Charlotte at the gate, while Sir William bowed repeatedly from the doorway. Elizabeth thought to herself, "Yes, she will do for him very well. She looks like she could make him a proper wife." The ladies departed, and Mr. Collins eagerly informed the girls of their good fortune. "We are all invited to dine at Rosings tomorrow," he announced with pride. That evening, Elizabeth couldn't help but laugh at the day's events as she wrote in her journal. She marvelled at the contrast between her lively imagination and the reality of Hunsford, eagerly awaiting what the next day at Rosings would bring. Chapter 29. An Invitation to Remember. Mr. Collins was beside himself with joy at the invitation to dine at Rosings. The chance to display the grandeur of his esteemed patroness and to showcase Lady Catherine's civility toward him and his wife was more than he had ever hoped for. The fact that this opportunity arose so soon after Elizabeth's arrival only heightened his admiration for Lady Catherine's condescension. "I must admit," he said, beaming with pride, "that I fully expected her ladyship might invite us for tea on Sunday, but to be asked to dinner, and so soon after your arrival, is a level of affability that exceeds even my expectations." Sir William Lucas, basking in his own self-importance, added, "Given my experience with the manners of the great, I am not at all surprised. Such elegant breeding is quite common at court." The entire day and the following morning were consumed with discussions about their visit to Rosings. Mr. Collins diligently instructed them on what to expect, ensuring that the splendour of the rooms, the number of servants, and the grandeur of the dinner would not overwhelm them. As the ladies prepared for the visit, Mr. Collins, unable to contain his excitement, visited their doors multiple times, urging them to be prompt, as Lady Catherine abhorred tardiness. "Do not worry, my dear cousin," he advised Elizabeth. "Lady Catherine does not expect us to match her and her daughter in elegance. Simply wear your best clothes. She prefers the distinction of rank to be maintained." The walk to Rosings was pleasant, the weather cooperating with clear skies and a gentle breeze. Elizabeth took in the park's beauty, though not with the rapture Mr. Collins expected. His enthusiastic recounting of the house's windows and the cost of the glazing left her more amused than impressed. As they climbed the steps to the grand hall, Maria's nerves were visibly frayed, and even Sir William appeared less than calm. Elizabeth, however, remained composed, confident that she could face Lady Catherine's stateliness without trepidation. Upon entering, Mr. Collins directed their attention to the hall's fine proportions and intricate ornaments with the zeal of a proud tour guide. They were then led through an antechamber to a drawing-room where Lady Catherine, her daughter, Miss de Bourgh, and Mrs. Jenkinson awaited them. Lady Catherine, a tall, imposing woman with strongly marked features, rose with great condescension to greet them. The introductions, handled by Mrs. Collins, were mercifully brief and devoid of Mr. Collins's usual verbosity. Sir William's awe left him nearly speechless, while Maria could hardly sit still from anxiety. Elizabeth, however, observed the scene with detached curiosity. Lady Catherine's authoritative tone and self-importance immediately reminded Elizabeth of Mr. Wickham's description of her. Miss de Bourgh, pale and sickly, offered little conversation, speaking only in a low voice to Mrs. Jenkinson, who was entirely preoccupied with her care. After a few minutes they were directed to a window to admire the view, with Mr. Collins eagerly pointing out its beauties. Lady Catherine informed them that the view was even more splendid in the summer. The dinner that followed was as grand as Mr. Collins had promised, complete with numerous servants and a table laden with splendid dishes. Mr. Collins, seated at the bottom of the table by Lady Catherine's command, beamed with satisfaction, carving and praising each dish with delighted enthusiasm. Sir William, now sufficiently recovered, echoed his son-in-law's sentiments, much to Elizabeth's amusement. Conversation was sparse, with Elizabeth trying to engage when possible, but mostly observing the dynamics around her. Lady Catherine dominated the discourse, offering advice on Charlotte's domestic arrangements and inquiring into Elizabeth's family with an intrusive curiosity that Elizabeth answered with composed politeness. When the gentlemen joined them after dinner, Lady Catherine led a round of card games. Elizabeth and Maria joined Mrs. Jenkinson and Miss de Bourgh at a separate table for casino, where the conversation was limited to the game and Mrs. Jenkinson's concerns for Miss de Bourgh's comfort. As the evening drew to a close, Lady Catherine arranged for her carriage to take the guests back to the parsonage. Mr. Collins and Sir William expressed their gratitude with numerous bows and speeches, while Elizabeth reflected on the evening's events. On the ride home, Mr. Collins eagerly solicited Elizabeth's opinion of Rosings. For Charlotte's sake, Elizabeth gave a more favourable review than she felt, but her praise couldn't match Mr. Collins's boundless admiration for his patroness. Chapter 30. a warm welcome and unexpected guests. Sir William stayed only a week at Hunsford, but his visit was long enough to reassure him that his daughter Charlotte was well settled and happy, with a husband who was attentive and a neighbour who was unparalleled in generosity. During his stay, Mr. Collins devoted his mornings to driving Sir William around the countryside in his gig, proudly showing off the local sights. But once Sir William departed, the family returned to their usual routines, much to Elizabeth's relief. Mr. Collins spent his mornings either tending to his garden, reading, writing, or peering out of the window in his study, which faced the road. The ladies sat in a room at the back of the house, a choice Elizabeth soon understood was to keep Mr. Collins at a comfortable distance. She silently praised Charlotte for her strategic arrangement. From their cosy drawing room, the ladies were shielded from the hustle and bustle of the lane. It was only thanks to Mr. Collins's diligent reports that they knew what carriages passed by, particularly Miss de Bourgh's phaeton, which he never failed to announce with great enthusiasm. Miss de Bourgh often stopped for brief conversations with Charlotte, but rarely stepped inside. Visits to Rosings were a frequent affair for the Collinses, almost a daily ritual. Initially, Elizabeth was puzzled by the sheer number of hours spent there, but soon surmised that Mr. Collins's hopes for another parish living might explain the devotion. Lady Catherine's visits to the parsonage were meticulously thorough. She scrutinized every detail of their activities, critiqued the arrangement of furniture, and even commented on the size of the meat joints Mrs. Collins prepared. It became clear to Elizabeth that Lady Catherine, though not officially a magistrate, wielded considerable authority in the parish, settling disputes and scolding the villagers into submission with unwavering dedication. Dinner at Rosings occurred twice a week, and these events, save for the absence of Sir William, were mirror images of their first grand evening. The local social scene was modest, with few engagements that matched the Collinses' means, a fact Elizabeth found to her liking. She relished the half-hours of pleasant conversation with Charlotte and enjoyed solitary walks along a sheltered path in the open grove bordering the park, beyond Lady Catherine's prying eyes. In this serene manner, the first fortnight of Elizabeth's visit slipped by. With Easter on the horizon, a new development stirred the otherwise tranquil atmosphere. Elizabeth learned that Mr. Darcy was expected to visit Rosings, a prospect that promised a change from the usual company. His arrival would provide a fresh dynamic, and Elizabeth looked forward to observing his interactions, especially considering Lady Catherine's evident intentions for him to marry her daughter, Miss de Bourgh. The news of Mr. Darcy's arrival spread quickly, thanks to Mr. Collins, who spent the morning pacing within sight of the lodge gates to witness his entrance. After spotting the carriage, he hurried home to relay the great news. The next morning, Mr. Collins hastened to Rosings to pay his respects. Along with Mr. Darcy came Colonel Fitzwilliam, Lady Catherine's other nephew, and to everyone's surprise, both gentlemen returned with Mr. Collins to the parsonage. Charlotte, having seen them crossing the road from her husband's study, quickly informed the ladies of their distinguished visitors. "I must thank you, Eliza," she said with a smile. "Mr. Darcy wouldn't have come so soon if not for you." Elizabeth had just enough time to deny any credit before the doorbell announced their arrival. Colonel Fitzwilliam, a well-mannered man in his 30s, led the way. Though not handsome, his demeanour was pleasing. Mr. Darcy, as reserved as ever, offered his formal greetings to Mrs. Collins and acknowledged Elizabeth with composed politeness, eliciting nothing more than a curtsy from her. Colonel Fitzwilliam engaged the group with the ease of a true gentleman, while Mr. Darcy sat quietly after making a few remarks about the house and garden. Eventually, he turned to Elizabeth and inquired about her family's well-being. Elizabeth replied cordially and then, with a hint of curiosity, asked, "My eldest sister has been in town these 3 months. Have you never happened to see her there?" Though Elizabeth was certain he had not, she wanted to observe his reaction. Mr. Darcy appeared slightly unsettled, but answered calmly that he had not had the pleasure. The conversation did not continue further, and soon the gentlemen took their leave, The visit, brief as it was, left Elizabeth with much to ponder. She knew their interactions at Rosings would be anything but dull with Mr. Darcy in attendance. As the days turned into weeks, Elizabeth found herself more accustomed to the rhythm of life at the parsonage. She and Charlotte often spent their mornings in the drawing-room, enjoying the sunlight filtering through the windows, and discussing everything from their childhood memories to the latest gossip from Meryton. The room was tastefully decorated with comfortable chairs, a large sofa, and Charlotte's prized tea set on display. The walls were adorned with modest but charming paintings, adding to the cosy atmosphere. Mr. Collins, true to form, spent most of his time either in his study or in the garden, proudly attending to his plants. His conversations with Lady Catherine had become a predictable routine, filled with his eager nodding and her authoritative instructions. Elizabeth couldn't help but admire Charlotte's patience and ability to manage her husband so deftly. The highlight of their week was always Sunday dinner at Rosings. The grandeur of Lady Catherine's estate never ceased to amaze Elizabeth, with its expansive gardens, ornate furniture, and the sheer number of servants bustling about. Each dinner was a lavish affair, with multiple courses and an array of fine wines. Mr. Collins, seated at the bottom of the table, beamed with pride as he carved the roast, his eyes sparkling with delight at every compliment from Lady Catherine. Elizabeth often found herself seated next to Colonel Fitzwilliam, who was quickly becoming a favourite companion. His easy manner and genuine interest in her thoughts made their conversations enjoyable and light-hearted. Unlike Mr. Darcy, who remained distant and reserved, Colonel Fitzwilliam brought a refreshing warmth to the table. One Sunday evening, after another elaborate dinner, Lady Catherine beckoned Elizabeth to join her in the drawing-room. The room was a testament to Lady Catherine's taste, with its high ceilings, intricate mouldings, and rich tapestries. Elizabeth couldn't help but feel a bit overawed by the grandeur. "Miss Bennet," Lady Catherine began, her tone as commanding as ever, "I understand you are quite accomplished in music and art. Do you play the piano?" "A little, Lady Catherine," Elizabeth replied modestly. "Well, we must hear you play then," Lady Catherine declared, leaving no room for refusal. Elizabeth sat at the grand piano, her fingers lightly touching the keys. As she began to play, she felt the eyes of everyone in the room on her. The music flowed smoothly, and she soon lost herself in the familiar melodies. When she finished, the room erupted in polite applause, and even Lady Catherine nodded in approval. "Very well, Miss Bennet," she said. "You play quite nicely, though I imagine with proper instruction you could improve significantly. Have you ever considered taking lessons from a master in London?" "My mother would have no objection, but my father is not fond of London," Elizabeth replied, managing a smile. Lady Catherine, clearly unimpressed with this reasoning, shook her head. "A pity, indeed. Proper education is of the utmost importance." Elizabeth spent the rest of the evening observing the interactions around her. Mr. Collins, as always, hovered near Lady Catherine, eager to agree with every word she uttered. Charlotte remained composed, gracefully handling the conversation with a blend of tact and humility. Colonel Fitzwilliam, sitting beside Elizabeth, offered occasional witty remarks that lightened the atmosphere. After the guests had departed and they were back at the parsonage, Elizabeth and Charlotte sat by the fire, sipping tea. The warmth of the flames contrasted with the coolness of the evening outside, casting a cosy glow in the room. "How do you endure it, Charlotte?" Elizabeth asked, referring to the endless reverence Mr. Collins showed towards Lady Catherine. Charlotte smiled gently. "I knew what I was getting into, Lizzie. Mr. Collins is a good man at heart, and Lady Catherine's patronage ensures our security. I've learned to find joy in the small things, our home, my garden, and, of course, having friends like you visit." Elizabeth admired Charlotte's practicality and strength. She realized that her friend had made the best of her situation, and there was much to be learned from her example. A few days later, a letter arrived for Elizabeth. It was from her aunt, Mrs. Gardiner, and contained an unexpected invitation. "Dearest Lizzie," it began, "we are planning a tour to the Lake District this summer and would be delighted if you could join us. It would be a wonderful escape, and we could all use the fresh air and beautiful scenery. Please say you'll come." Elizabeth's heart soared at the thought of such an adventure. She could already imagine the stunning landscapes, the serene lakes, and the time spent with her beloved aunt and uncle. It would be a perfect respite from the complexities of Hertfordshire and the looming presence of Lady Catherine. When she shared the news with Charlotte, her friend's eyes twinkled with excitement for her. "That sounds marvellous, Lizzie. You must go. It will do you a world of good." As Easter approached, the anticipation of Mr. Darcy's visit added a new layer of intrigue. Elizabeth couldn't help but feel a mix of curiosity and apprehension. The memory of his aloofness in Hertfordshire lingered, but she also sensed there was more to Mr. Darcy than his stern exterior revealed. The day of his arrival was marked by a flurry of activity. Mr. Collins, ever eager to impress, busied himself with preparations, while Charlotte ensured everything was in order. Elizabeth, determined to maintain her composure, took a long walk in the garden to clear her mind. When the carriage finally pulled up, Mr. Collins dashed out to greet his esteemed guest. Mr. Darcy emerged, tall and imposing as ever, followed by Colonel Fitzwilliam, who offered a warm smile. "Mr. Darcy, Colonel Fitzwilliam, welcome to Hunsford," Mr. Collins declared with a flourish. "We are honoured by your presence." Charlotte and Elizabeth stood at the entrance, ready to greet the newcomers. Charlotte's calm demeanour provided a stark contrast to Mr. Collins's exuberance, and Elizabeth couldn't help but admire her friend's grace under pressure. Colonel Fitzwilliam approached Elizabeth first. "Miss Bennet, it's a pleasure to see you again," he said warmly. "Likewise, Colonel," Elizabeth replied, genuinely pleased by his friendly manner. Mr. Darcy's approach was more reserved. "Miss Bennet," he said, with a polite nod. "Mr. Darcy," Elizabeth responded, matching his formality. As they all gathered in the drawing-room, the conversation flowed more easily than Elizabeth had anticipated. Colonel Fitzwilliam's charm and good humour helped to bridge any awkwardness, and even Mr. Darcy seemed slightly more at ease. The evening passed with various discussions, and Elizabeth found herself frequently conversing with Colonel Fitzwilliam. He had a way of making even mundane topics seem interesting, and his genuine interest in her thoughts was refreshing. At one point, Mr. Darcy joined their conversation. "Miss Bennet, have you had a chance to explore the grounds of Rosings?" he inquired. "Not extensively, Mr. Darcy. Perhaps you could recommend a few spots worth visiting," Elizabeth replied. He seemed to consider this for a moment. "The gardens are quite beautiful this time of year. There's a particular grove that offers a lovely view of the countryside. If you're interested, I could show you around." Elizabeth was taken aback by his offer, but accepted graciously. "That would be delightful, thank you." The following morning, true to his word, Mr. Darcy escorted Elizabeth through the gardens of Rosings. As they walked, he pointed out various features and shared snippets of history about the estate. Elizabeth couldn't help but notice the pride in his voice when he spoke of his family's legacy. "I hope you find the gardens to your liking, Miss Bennet," he said, looking at her with an intensity that made her heart flutter. "They are indeed beautiful, Mr. Darcy. Thank you for showing me around," she replied, meeting his gaze. As the days passed, Elizabeth found herself re-evaluating her opinions of Mr. Darcy. His reserved nature, which she had once interpreted as arrogance, seemed more like a shield guarding a deeply private person. The more time they spent together, the more she saw glimpses of a man who was thoughtful, considerate, and, dare she admit, kind. One evening, after a particularly enjoyable dinner, Elizabeth and Colonel Fitzwilliam found themselves alone in the drawing-room. "Miss Bennet," he began, "I must confess something. My cousin, Mr. Darcy, has spoken highly of you on several occasions. I believe he holds you in great esteem." Elizabeth was surprised by this revelation. "I appreciate your honesty, Colonel. Mr. Darcy is an enigma to me. Colonel Fitzwilliam chuckled. He can be quite perplexing, but I assure you his intentions are always honourable. Elizabeth pondered his words long after the conversation had ended. Perhaps there was more to Mr. Darcy than she had initially thought. As Easter drew to a close, the time came for Elizabeth to bid farewell to Hunsford and return to Longbourn. She felt a mix of sadness and excitement, having grown fond of her time with Charlotte, but also eager for the adventures that awaited her with the Gardiners. On her last day, Mr. Darcy approached her with a seriousness that piqued her curiosity. "Miss Bennet, I hope you have enjoyed your stay here. It has been enlightening," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Indeed, Mr. Darcy, it has been a memorable visit," Elizabeth replied, sensing there was more he wanted to say. He hesitated for a moment, then added, "I hope our paths cross again soon." Elizabeth smiled. "So do I, Mr. Darcy." As the carriage pulled away from the parsonage, Elizabeth felt a sense of anticipation. Her journey was far from over, and she knew that the next chapter would bring new challenges, joys, and perhaps even love.
This is the end of Part 3 of Pride and Prejudice, reimagined in the style of best-selling romance author Carolyn Brown. Please take a moment to like and subscribe. You can hear the rest of this story by following along in the Pride and Prejudice playlist on the Classic Books Reimagined channel. We will see you soon for Part 4.